All right, everyone, it's 3 o'clock and we're ready to get started. I am Janet Seymour. I'm the Outreach Director with the Wisconsin Historical Society, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this webinar. Since we want to get straight to our panelists and moderators, we just spend a few minutes here on housekeeping details. Your microphone and camera will be muted when you're in this meeting. Please use the chat function if you have any technical issues or general comments. If you have general comments to share, that chat function will let you write to all panelists and attendees. We want to strongly encourage you to use that Q&A tab function to ask your questions today during the presentation. So the questions you want to ask of our panelists and our moderators, please use the Q&A tab for those. I just want to mention that this session is being recorded and we will make it available as soon as we can after the conversation or after the webinar today. So you'll receive an email that the webinar has been recorded and is available to view within a day or two after the presentation. So we'll get straight to our conversation today. It's my pleasure to introduce the Ruth and Hartley Barker Director and CEO of the Wisconsin Historical Society, Christian Øverland.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you all for joining us today. For those of you who don't know the Wisconsin Historical Society, we started in 1846, early on as one of America's earliest historical societies, and we have been collecting North American history ever since. So we tell the story of Wisconsin, but also through the lens of North America. Our mission, quite frankly, and our purpose is to connect people to the past by collecting and stewarding the collections and sharing them. And the Society is also an important organization for convening dialogues like this today. We are actually doing our first seminar of a 3-panel seminar that started. Today's national seminar is about monuments, meaning, markers, and meaning, a national conversation. The second one that we'll be having is actually focusing on Wisconsin state monuments, as well as the meaning of them and markers. And then we're using the first and the second seminars to combine into a third seminar at our local history conference and preservation conference coming up this October 21st through October 23rd. So the idea of this is an iterative learning session for us to work with you, our communities, and that's really what it's all about, is to actually present and connect you to experts in history, and for us to help work together with our communities to build a better future. So I'd like to introduce my co-facilitator today, Dr. Robert Smith, and he's also one of my colleagues as he's working with us in the Wisconsin Historical Society. Today, Dr. Smith is the Harry G. John Professor of History at Marquette University. He's the Director of Curato, which is Marquette University's Center for Urban Research, Teaching, and Outreach. As I said, he's also a member of the Wisconsin Historical Society's Board of Curators, which is the Wisconsin Historical Society's governing board. Please welcome Dr. Robert Smith.
Thank you, Christian. I obviously have to get my mute squared away. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today. This is a very critical conversation as we embark upon some very challenging, anxiety-inducing, complicated, confusing, and frustrating times in our society. We have witnessed over the last several months a remarkable set of responses, a nationwide upsurge in resistance to what has been the long-standing practices associated with police violence and murder, and really state violence more broadly. We saw the beginnings of this decades ago, of course, but something has happened over the last 10 or so years where digital technology has brought us directly and squarely face to face with these injustices. After the murder of Trayvon Martin, we witnessed the important developments associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, and then its accompanying grassroots mobilization around the movement for Black lives. And so what we see today in our streets has been in the makings for several decades, and then most recently, the last several years, a well coordinated set of responses that are now calling for defunding the police and or potentially abolishing the criminal justice apparatus as we know it today. And this has been a collection of widely diverse voices, widely diverse populations of folks taking part in these movements on the ground here recently, such that recent data suggests that somewhere around 7 million people have taken part in these protests over the last several weeks and months, which is really remarkable, making it quite possibly one of the largest sustained movements in US history, and brings us squarely and face to face with the idea that we are indeed in the midst of a third Reconstruction. And as much as this current moment is about police violence, it's also a clear and stinging indictment on white supremacy. The battle lines are clearly drawn, and I think we all understand very clearly how those lines have fallen. And it's a moment where the nation is being forced to reckon with the broader system of white supremacy. It's a moment where we see the President of the United States making nods to white supremacists and neo-Nazis. We know for a fact that now police departments have been peppered with members who have leanings and affiliations with white nationalist organizations. And so our attacks on monuments, the conversation we're having today is a direct outgrowth of that broader societal conversation we're having, which is fundamentally, is the United States going to be a nation that makes clear and stays committed to its promises associated with democracy, or if indeed we are going to continue to be hampered by longstanding emblems and systems and mechanisms that promote white supremacy. If that wasn't enough, this is all occurring during the COVID-19 pandemic, which we know has had a disastrous and disproportionate impact on minority communities. COVID-19 has also exposed how deeply fractured we are as a nation, such that the very practices that could help to prevent the spread of the pandemic, the disease itself, has become politicized through, of all things, the wearing of a mask. The very notion that public health experts and scientists and science more broadly has come under the umbrella of this deeply politicized moment is also very frightening for all of us, because we don't immediately see a way out for the United States. But this conversation today, Christian, I think is really important too, and I want to talk just briefly, and then I'll wrap up about the role of the board that I sit on and other historical societies, and the roles that we have in making sure that we are creating a set of monuments, markers, and other historical depictions that accurately embrace and welcome the full breadth of the diversity of the folks who live in our countries, our states, our cities, our environs. And so this is a very scary moment. It's an important moment because of the potential for change, but it is one where those of us who are in the world of looking to preserve and promote history, we have a responsibility to play to make sure that the historical record reflects all of us who have been a part of this nation. And so I look forward to hearing from our panelists, and I look forward to engaging in our conversation today as this question around monuments hits squarely at this very fundamental question of what are we going to do about the vestiges of white supremacy in our nation. And so I look forward to our conversation, Christian.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. So our panelists today, we have three, Karen Cox, Ken Loom, as well as Jeffrey Robinson. Unfortunately, Jeffrey Robinson couldn't make it today, but he did send a video, so we have his position statement on it for us to discuss. He sends his regrets. First, let me introduce Karen Cox, who is professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and the founding director of the Graduate Public History program at North Carolina as well. Dr. Cox is an award-winning historian and distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. She is the author of numerous essays and articles, as well as 4 books on Southern history and culture. Her books include Dixie's Daughters, The United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the Preservation of Confederate Culture, as well as Dreaming of Dixie, How the South Was Created in American Popular Culture. Dr. Cox has also written many op-eds in numerous publications and regularly gives media interviews in the US and around the globe on the subject of Southern history and culture. Her forthcoming book that we're all looking forward to is No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Equality, which will be published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2021. Second speaker will be Ken Loom, and he is known for his conceptual and representational art in the media of a number of media expressions, including painting, sculpture, and photography. A longtime professor, he is currently chair of fine arts at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Design in Philadelphia. As well, he's the co-founder and chief curatorial advisor for Monument Lab. Loom was the co-creator of Monument Lab, a public art and history project, a citywide public art exhibition in Philadelphia in 2017. The exhibition dealt with the ways in which space is engaged in terms of the city's monumental landscape. As well, the aim of Monument Lab was to better understand the mechanisms and memorialization by questioning the status of the monument in the context of canonical disposition. The exhibition was widely praised and became a touchstone for other cities dealing with controversial monuments and statues. So we're going to hear from Dr. Cox and then Ken Loom, and then we'll talk about Jeffrey Robinson's video. Dr. Cox.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be with you in the Wisconsin Historical Society. Thanks for the invitation to be here, and I'm very honored to join Ken Loom as well. I was thinking about what Rob just said about these vestiges of white supremacy, and how these things are linked. And I've been thinking a lot about George Floyd's murder and what led to the Black Lives Matter movement, and then which also consequently led to protests in the South that then turned their anger on these Confederate monuments, because these monuments are vestiges of white supremacy. And so what I thought I would do for people, since they're probably unfamiliar with just the history of Confederate monuments, is offer that history, explain how they got to be there, and just a couple other points of what I think is important to understand about Confederate monuments. Confederate monuments were being built almost immediately after the Civil War. The region went through a few phases in terms of their building. Initially, what we call the Bereavement Phase, and that's during the period of Reconstruction, when most monuments were erected in cemeteries. At the end of Reconstruction, and federal troops have left, and Southerners retake what they call home rule, take over their legislatures, etc. Then we begin to enter a phase of what I would call celebration of the Confederacy through this narrative that we call the Lost Cause. And the Lost Cause refers to Confederate defeat, but it also refers to an entire movement that describes things like monument building, as well as writing historical texts, etc. And probably the most iconic of this celebratory period, the most iconic monument, is the Lee Monument on Monument Avenue, which was unveiled in 1890. And then in the 1890s, we enter a new period of monument building that is led primarily by Southern white women. A group known as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, also known as the UDC, or the Daughters. And it's in this period between 1890 and 1920, which accompanied the rise of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, in which we see the vast majority of monuments that are built. We know that there are approximately 800. There could be, give or take. We never really know, but of that 800, the vast majority were built in this period between 1890 and 1920. The Daughters as an organization was, they were literally daughters or granddaughters of Confederate soldiers. And so this new phase in which they sort of take over the leadership of the lost cause is what I refer to as a phase of vindication. They want to vindicate their ancestors or their parents and grandparents for Confederate defeat, and reset the narrative. And the narrative is a revisionist narrative for sure, that says, you know, that the Confederacy may have been defeated, but it was a just cause. Slavery was not the cause of the war. They say it was only about states' rights. And so it begins to sort of sanitize what happened during the Civil War by stripping slavery from the narrative of the war, and then presents these men as heroes, the Confederate soldiers. And so the vast majority of those monuments are dedicated to Confederate soldiers from a particular locale. And what's also unique about this period in the early 20th century is the fact that Confederate monuments are now being placed on the grounds of courthouses and state capitals. And that's a very significant move, because this is adjacent to lawmaking bodies of the legislature, but also next to a courthouse where one could, if you were a Black citizen, might not expect to receive fair treatment. And against all of this, the background in which these monuments went up, we're also seeing the establishment of Jim Crow, segregation, disenfranchisement of Black men, a reversal of the 15th Amendment. There's an epidemic of lynching. There are race massacres in towns from Atlanta to Tulsa. And on these grounds, very often, these lynchings took place on the very courthouse grounds where these Confederate monuments stand or stood. And so the white Southerners are building these monuments against a backdrop in which African Americans are being forced into second-class citizenship. We would continue to see monuments built every decade since 1920. And since 2000, there have been 35 new monuments unveiled across the South, not in these same places. Some of these are in battlefield situations on private property or in cemeteries. But again, the fact that they're continuing to be built is something that is of concern. One of the things I think is very important to understand about Confederate monuments is that they are intensely local objects. The fundraising was done locally. Sometimes the actual local government committed tax dollars to these monuments. They were built by the UDC, but then cared for by the local government or the city or county government. And so when I think about these monuments and what happens to them, I think about this is that what should happen should be able to be determined by local citizens. But what we have in the case of the South is that we have these state monument laws. Each of the Southern states have them, which prevents removal. It's meant to prevent removal, although as you've no doubt seen in the news over the last month or so, we've definitely had a number of removals. The thing that's important to kind of understand this is the timing of these laws, is that most of them were passed since the Charleston massacre in 2015. It is, you know, and which is, these laws undermine local control, which means local communities or governments, even if they want to remove a monument, have been prevented from doing so. And it's also led to the protests we've seen. And so I want to clarify for everyone that people who say, well, why don't protesters just, you know, petition this, or why do they have to get in the streets? Why do they have to vandalize these monuments, etc.? Well, what's happened is that with these state laws, a couple of things has happened. One, the laws prevent local communities from doing anything about the monument that's in that community and affects those citizens. But the other thing is that those monument laws were passed by legislatures who were ushered into office because of gerrymandering. And so you have largely GOP-led legislature. And what that means is that it also then ties monuments and what happens to them to voter suppression. Because if your local government can't do anything, and you can't, there's no local redress, and you cannot elect officials who represent your views about removing monuments, then what recourse do you have? And so people have gone into the streets because some of these, like even if you had a petition, it would require a 2/3 majority of a state legislature to even move a monument or to change the law. And so what we've seen recently in the last few weeks is that some cities, including North Carolina, where I live, have gone ahead and removed a monument. So they're challenging the state law, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. One of the things I think it's important to understand about monuments, and I think this is true of all monuments, is that these monuments reflect the values of the individual who placed that monument there. They are that's why they're there in the first place, because it's a generation of people wanted to put these monuments into place. Well, this, in the case of Confederate monuments, we're talking about a generation of people, or more than one generation of people, who subscribe to the values of Jim Crow. So I refer to them as the Jim Crow generation. And so those, the monuments then often, are a reflection of them more than they are about history. And that kind of leads me to my final points here, is that monuments do not teach history. I've never learned a lesson of history from a monument. What they do is support a false narrative of the past. And if you wanted to say that they represent history, you could say, well, it represents Jim Crow history, or it represents a revisionist history of the Civil War, of slavery, of Reconstruction. In my estimation, these monuments are artifacts of Jim Crow. I think of them that way. As a public historian, I think I'm good with saying that these are artifacts. They're like whites only signs that signal to Black Southerners that they're second-class citizens. And so we know, even though there are no longer whites only signs, we know those signs existed. History documents that they existed. And I would say the same is true about monuments, that in the case of Confederate monuments, in the event of removal, we will always know that that monument has been there. We have photographs, we have postcards, we have tourist brochures, we have video in some cases. We have all the documents in which to study the history of these statues. And so I don't think there's any fear of us losing history here. What we're losing, again, is an artifact of Jim Crow and a narrative that's dominated the landscape of the South for over a century. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cox. Now we're going to hear from Ken Blum.
Ken,
Thank
you're
you,
on.
Dr. Cox. I want to say something about the history of Monument Lab, and then go into the question of what is a monument, and such. Monument Lab started in 2012 in Philadelphia between Dr. Paul Farber and myself. We were both relatively new to Philadelphia. In fact, I was totally new. I just moved in from Canada, assuming a position at the University of Pennsylvania. And Paul was returned after completing his PhD at U Michigan. And we were both teaching classes about public space, the production of public space, and the place of monuments within space. And we were asking very similar questions about our backyard, the Philadelphia landscape. Because I was quite new to the city, I was very curious in terms of all the markers and statuary that made up the inventory of monuments as Philadelphia. I live very near Billie Holiday's home, and I know that there was a marker there, but no statue. I guess I assumed that due to her celebrity, she would have a statue, but that was not to be. And as I discovered on the same day, touring City Hall of Philadelphia for the first time, I came upon a statue of John Wanamaker, whom I wasn't very familiar with. He turned out to be a business leader in the earlier part of the 20th century who had a namesake department store. And I'm not saying that John Wanamaker wasn't deserving of a statue on the grounds of City Hall, no less, but that Billie Holiday surely did as well. And so I was very interested in this discrepancy in terms of the statuary inventory, in terms of certain questions of why was the inventory the way it was? Why was it hierarchized in the way it was? Why? What sort of decisions went into it? Clearly, we know that monuments and statues are an embodiment of power, and they serve as tools or to commemorate, right? And they serve as a kind of memory aid in terms of the depicted person to be remembered throughout time, in fact. And so the unevenness of this was interesting to me in the sense that when I looked at a statue of John Wanamaker, I didn't just see the positive presence of John Wanamaker. I also saw the negative absence of Billie Holiday. I'm not blaming John Wanamaker. I'm just saying it was the game I started to play in terms of if someone is represented, who is not being represented. If someone is being heeded, who is not being heeded. And so I was very interested in the alternative histories which were not expressed for all kinds of reasons, many of them probably dubious as well. And so that led to a discussion of Monument Lab and trying to figure out an entity that could deal with the questions of the play of power that monuments come to be. In Philadelphia, for example, there are over 1,000 statues that make up the inventory of public statues. Of that more than 10,000, only 2 are of full-figured women. That's not counting probably 100 or so of mythical muses. I'm talking about historical figures. None of the 2 were of women from Philadelphia. There are Joan of Arc, and from France, obviously, and Mary Dyer, who was a Quaker from the Boston area. And so these sorts of things kind of led us into this pedagogical or teaching project of trying to uncover alternative histories that aren't necessarily visible in the presence of an existing monument, but was palpable in terms of the alternative narratives that that are not at play. So why does this matter? This matters because monuments are part of a syndicate of production of national or regional or local narratives. They have a symbolic capital, which is very, very important in terms of the entire infrastructure of the way we think about the image or the imagining of a locale or region or a nation. They're imbued with a kind of mythology and so on. And we were also interested in the way monuments behave or the way they comport and the way viewers are interpolated or told to respond to monuments. We assume monuments to be benign. We like to believe that monuments are are the result of consensual decision-making, that they represent the collective will of a sufficient critical mass of people that made it possible for that monument to be where it is. And we also assume that the language to be quite naturalized as part of history and objective, and not something that was subjective and so on. We recognize that they are the epitome of an expression of power, but we also recognize that that power is not to be challenged, not to be questioned, not to be deconstructed. And so we were asking all these sorts of questions, and also noticing that there was no real formalized entity. There was obviously, you had artists working in anti-monuments and negative monuments and all kinds of essays about the problematics of monuments, such as Dr. Cox is doing, or Kirk Savage is doing, and so on. But there was no kind of collective entity that dealt with this question of monuments. And so Monument Lab came to be. And since 2012, we've been, and especially after the success of the 2017 exhibition, and we've been involved in all kinds of an advisory role for many, many cities. We were asked to join in the debate of George Washington murals at the George Washington High School in Richmond High School, in Richmond, San Francisco, I should say. They were murals of George Washington done in the 1930s. We have worked with cities like Newark, Memphis, New Orleans, Toronto, Los Angeles, and now we've been asked by the city of Munich and the city of Antwerp, Belgium, to deal with the problem of King Leopold II, who was the founding, you might say the founding father of modern Belgium, and yet he was also the ruler of the Belgian Congo, in which probably up to 8 million Congolese were killed, and so on. So these sorts of questions that we deal with, we are not just we're interesting because, for example, I'm an artist but have very strong academic leanings. I've written 2 books, including a lot of jury papers as well. And Paul Farber is a art historian and historian of American history, but he also thinks very artistically. And so we both have a long history of curatorial projects of special types of shows. I curated the show Shanghai Modern 1919-1945 about the Republican period of China before the Chinese Revolution, and also worked on the short century exhibition, Independence and movements in and liberation movements in Africa, 1945-1994. And so Monument Lab is a part studio, part pedagogical project, part intellectual pursuit that is very open-ended, very fluid in terms of our methodologies. And we are always seeking the most creative, most innovative, and most surprising techniques to respond to the challenges that we face today regarding the question of monuments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. So now we're going to play a video because Jeffrey Robinson couldn't be here. Jeffrey Robinson is the Deputy Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, as well as the Director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Trone Center for Justice and Equality, which houses the work in criminal justice, racial justice, and reform issues. Jeffrey's had 3 decades of experience working on these issues, as well as more than 3 decades being a trial lawyer. Jeff was not able to join us today. However, to present his position, we're playing a short video of a talk that he gave on the removal of Confederate monuments, the truth about the Confederacy. This was originally presented on October 6, 2017.
This is the website's, the memorial, the website for the Robert E. Lee Memorial, 2 days before Charlottesville, Virginia. This is the website 2 days after Charlottesville. This is not a true reckoning of our history. This is simply a continued attempt to water down the truth about Robert E. Lee. And I say this once again, I know he has living descendants, and I am not saying this to offend them, and I apologize if this causes pain to them. But Robert E. Lee made his choices. And as W.E.B. Du Bois said, he's got to live with them. And those choices were strength and physical valor, but moral cowardice. So some of these statues are coming down. They're being removed in the dark of night because the city officials don't want to remove them in the day because there might be disputes, there might be violence, there might be fighting. My only point is this: there is a movement in America that has not been in existence in my lifetime. I was 11 years old in Memphis when King was shot and killed, and I was young, but I was old enough to know enough. And I knew what was happening then. I heard the discussions that were going on in the civil rights movement because they weren't discussions in a history book. These were discussions that were going on when my mother and father walked out the door in the morning. My father was an educator, my mother a homemaker, and they were deeply involved in the civil rights movement. And what I'm telling you is the discussions about racial equality that were going on then are nowhere near as deep, as intense, and as revealing as the discussions that are going on today. As scared as I feel and as frustrated as I feel with what's going on in this country, there is a part of me that says we are on the cusp of something. This is a freaking tipping point, and it is going to go one way or the other. And I am saying to everybody sitting in this room, it is part of your responsibility which way this tip occurs. Because for many of us, while we are all Americans and we share that together, for many of us, there are some of us who will walk out of this room tonight and you can forget about everything that I've said, and it won't make a difference in your life for a while. But I promise you, the walls that we build between each other, based on race, based on wealth, they're not high enough to keep the tide back. I'm not talking about violent revolution or anything like that, although that certainly is a possibility, a remote one, I think. What I'm talking about is an America where you don't have 2.3 million people in prison, you got 4.5 million people in prison. And you don't have 80% of Americans owning 7% of the wealth. You have 90% of Americans owning about 2% of the wealth. Nobody is going to want to live in that America. Taking down these monuments will not cure the problem, but it is at least an indication that we are ready to deal with the truth.
So I appreciate all three of our perspectives of our panelists. And now the purpose of this is to convene a discussion with all of our participants. And it's been very active on both the chat and the Q&A. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Janet Seymour and Kristen Leffelman, who are going to bring up the Q&A session questions to us, and so we can have a lively dialogue. Janet, Kristen.
All right, I'll go ahead with the first question and then I'll pass it to Kristen. First question, in the effort of being proactive and responsible historians, how should statues and monuments of US presidents in our communities who are known to have owned slaves be recontextualized even if they are not currently the subject of reinterpretation or targets as symbols of white supremacy. Does one of our panelists want to take that question?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think,
Go ahead.
You know, if you take someone like Jefferson, right, or Washington, you, as you say, you contextualize their contribution to the founding of the country, but you also make note of how human they were in terms of whatever, in terms of owning slaves and so on. And I mean, human in the sense of a weakness. Human is in terms of, you know, not transcending certain expectations we may have, you know, certainly from today's perspective. But I also think you look for in, let's say Jefferson, whether within what he has contributed in his writings, his thinking, did he provide an opening, at least even if it is only in discourse or rhetoric, for a post-racialized future. And I think that's of merit, that's of note. And that's of, that doesn't excuse, you know, his being a slave owner, but it is a, you know, it is what it is. It doesn't excuse it, but it does provide for, you know, a more complex person, which is very different from Robert E. Lee, right? Where Robert E. Lee was didn't provide any of the discourse or intellectual ken through words and language that transcended these challenging problems that we have today.
And I would just add to that, you know, why the monuments to someone like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were placed for their contributions to the nation. The monuments to the Confederate leaders and soldiers were, you know, are monuments to people who took up arms against the nation. And in the case of Robert E. Lee, you know, led an army to that was and other generals as well. But I mean, they were in a war to perpetuate human slavery. That's what they were there doing. And people want to talk about states' rights all day long, and that's what these statues represent, and that's what the Confederacy was about. But the Confederacy was about maintaining and perpetuating human slavery. And if it's a states' rights issue, it's a state's right to continue to perpetuate slavery.
Okay, so our next question: what are the most productive, creative, or emancipatory ways that communities can use spaces where monuments once stood?
I
think that's a Ken question.
I would say, well, artists, and I would say, first of all, even before getting to that point, the removal of a statue in the stealth of night without any without any input in the form of creative responses from artists, thinkers, members of the public, whomever they may be. I think that's a lost opportunity in terms of fomenting a kind of positive dialogue, and even dialogue that may have elements of points of view that we may not agree with. I think it's really important to have that dialogue. And so that's my worry, is that, you know, a lot of the statues are just removed and without any dialogue that ensues. And I think that represents a kind of risk of the dialogue never actually taking place, that the statue is no longer there, and so on. Having said that, with a lot of statues being removed, I think there's all kinds of, if you're familiar with the contemporary art, there's a lot of very innovative responses to empty plinths, to negative or so-called anti-monuments, which has now become a genre of art, in fact, and to engaging school children to whatever, to think anew in terms of what could replace it and so on. I don't think, I don't think a statue needs to be replaced by a statue is one thing. There's all kinds of possibilities, and it's a lot of fun to, besides being serious business, to actually think about alternatives and why those alternatives are important to think about.
Excellent. So the next one I want to look at is, what is the expectation for the collection and preservation of fallen monuments by museums and historical societies? What are the pros and cons of supporting stewardship of these items?
I think it's quite an onerous responsibility for museums and historical societies. Their mission is not, and it may not be to collect to begin with. If they have a collections policy, the collections policy, I'm sure, probably does not include monuments. But again, in the case of the Confederate monuments, these things are going to be decided locally, whether or not it ends up in a museum or it goes back to a cemetery. There were so many ways that this could be addressed, and it's going to depend on each local community. In the case of these Confederate monuments, or unless in the case of the Lee Monument, which is a state-owned monument, that will be a different approach. But I think the important thing is what Ken just mentioned, is that there has to be conversation and dialogue around why these monuments are problematic to begin with. Why, it's only a symbolic gesture to just take a monument, remove it, and in many cases, these are in storage. We don't know where they're going. Communities are still deciding. It's very much an issue that we see that it's in flux right now in terms of what can be done. And I think it's going to take a lot. It's going to take, first of all, I think we should, communities ought to be having discussions about white supremacy and systemic racism, which led to people protesting these monuments to begin with. Because those are real issues that need to be addressed. By removing a monument and saying, well, we're going to move this and place it with a museum, which is often a response to people give that this is what should happen. It's not a well thought out response or a solution. And so I think there's opportunities for creativity. Again, if there's an empty pedestal, that's something that can be done. I mean, I think among some of us in history, we felt like, the Lee Monument with all its graffiti probably got the best context it's ever had. And so maybe that becomes, it gets moved somewhere where it can be studied as art, but also studied as a site of protest. I mean, I think there are just numerous ways in which this can happen.
And in terms of historical societies and other museums, it is an onerous task. As Dr. Cox said, one of the things that we are charged with as far as historical societies and history museums is presenting the facts of history and collecting them and preserving them. So the stories of why the monuments is maybe our job in terms of collecting and archival reasons of why these monuments went up and why they were taken down. I think that there's roles for organizations in this entire story. And I think an important role for museums and historical societies is figuring out how to document that, as well as thinking about the future, how to convene these type of dialogues and conversations about what those mean.
I think there's a concern about the removal of monuments being equated with the removal of history, even if the monument itself is a carrier of a false, mystified history, but that's actually a kind of a false identification, because I think it doesn't mean that when a statue of Robert Lee Lee is removed, that somehow Robert Lee Lee disappears from history. There's lots of material on Robert E. Lee. There's lots of material even of the lost cause in terms of the, you can probably write a thesis on the Daughters of the Confederacy, right? And their methods and why and so on, right? So that history, to tie the history to the actual bronze or marble, I think is actually a false one.
Thank you. There's a question here that I'd like to touch on, bringing up the perspective of First Nation peoples. Question, this also makes me think of the monuments in Green Bay, Wisconsin, that depict white men colonizing our First Nation people. How do we go about removing those?
My response would be, I mean, in the similar way that we would hope in the South we would remove a Confederate monument. I think it depends on what your state laws have to say. If there's any room in that for removal, I think it requires a community committed to removal, so in a similar way that has happened in the South, we certainly have these monuments that are state sponsored, and those are kinds of conversations I think you may need to be having with your legislators at the state level, it certainly begins, I believe, in the community in which these monuments currently sit.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this statue in Canada. It's a giant column of Joseph Brown, no, not Joseph Brown, who is it? I can't remember. But anyways, I think it was Brant, the Brant monument. And right next to it is, and there's no mention of Tecumseh, who is the native partner in the War of 1812. And so what happened was Native Canadians put up a little Dreamweaver's sculpture made up of twigs right next to the column that's close to 80 feet tall. And so it didn't involve the removal of the column of the statue, but it was counterpointed by the presence of this much more modest makeshift sculpture, you might say, and saturated with all kinds of native iconography and ritual signifiers. And it gets replaced all the time. There are so many notes that accumulate around the Tecumseh, what's now known as the Tecumseh Monument, even though that monument's only about 1.5 feet tall, right? And about how the terrible trauma visited upon Native North Americans and so on. And that one modest response, which is now permanent and protected by the Canadian government, actually defeats the entire presence of the much bigger column. So I think even in terms of this question of in Green Bay, I think there are all kinds of alternatives. Should they be removed? I'm sympathetic to that, but I also am open to the question of what kind of responses could a Native American artist from Wisconsin do in terms of the response to those problematic edifices.
We're getting sort of a group of questions about non-Confederate monuments. So there have been a lot of discussions lately about folks like Abraham Lincoln, Christopher Columbus, Thomas Jefferson. and the idea that maybe there's a slippery slope of if you take certain ones down, you know, at what point do you stop? So I'm wondering if you could address that, and also a question of, you know, how we decide who we commemorate in our built landscape.
Well, I mean, you know, there are certainly laws protecting some of these monuments that you referenced, you know, to these national leaders, et cetera. There's been this narrative of slippery slope going on probably for 3 decades, at least among Confederate monuments. And this, I mean, I think the same thing applies here right now. We've not seen that happen. First of all, to not have, you know, other than a few monuments like, that have been vandalized, the vast majority remain. So is it a slippery slope? I don't know. I mean, we don't know. It's in flux right now. You know, it's interesting to be having this conversation when removals are still taking place, and what does that mean, you know, at the national level? Again, we're going to be, you know, if what's happened in our region is any indication, it's like what's happening at the national level. We may see laws go into place, like, you know, the president's executive order that, you know, protect monuments and exact, you know, extreme punishment on these people who try to vandalize it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the logic of the slippery slope argument, the problem I have with it is that it arrests the possibility of doing any action towards a very problematic monument like a Confederate statue. And so, because if you apply that logic and extend it to the absolute horizon line, then it's like, well, that's part of a continuum. It's a slippery slope, so we better not remove or deal with the Robert E. Lee, right? So that's why I think it's slightly false to make that argument. As I said earlier, in terms of Jefferson, another example would be like Winston Churchill. Did he, especially in his youth, write about anti-Semitism? Yes. He was an aristocrat, not excusing that, and he probably was an anti-Semite. You know, that was a context and so on, and that's not excusable. But did he also turn out to be a transcendent figure in terms of binding all Britons? And I would say yes, and that's also important, right? As opposed to someone like Cecil Rhodes, for example, just to carry on with the English analogy, who believed in apartheid, who was a racist, and was unremittingly so. So that's, I think those types of distinctions need to be made.
I just want to add, I just think it's really, really important that, you know, as a historian and other historians here, I think we've got to get the message out there, the correct message, the correct history about these statues, so that people understand them, not just through conversations like we're having, but also conversations around, you know, around our founding fathers or around Christopher Columbus. And it's like helped people to understand why these things are offensive, and because they probably, some people just don't know the history, and they would be benefit from that. If they knew the history, they would probably have a more understanding of why these things are you know, offensive to certain communities. And this is the thing, where, you know, these monuments that have been placed on the landscape have represented a dominant narrative. I mean, I refer to, you know, these monuments, especially the Confederate monuments, it's another, you know, weapon in the arsenal of white supremacy. They understood that that's what they were, then maybe they could be a little more, you know, sympathetic. But, you know, in the South, we've had the issue of this false narrative known as the lost cause that has dominated the way people have thought about the Confederate past have thought, the way they've taught their children for generations, the way this false narrative gets passed down one generation after another, until you have people who are well-educated people who still don't understand that that's a revisionist history. And they're trying to, suggest that I'm the revisionist. So I think we've got to do a better job of educating people. I think that's why I participate in conversations like this. It's why I'm active on Twitter. It's why, and I just think it's so important, and not just to have these conversations among ourselves as academics, but to have them with the communities where it really has meaning. And we've got to create that understanding and assist people in having that understanding.
Karen, as this conversation highlights, as much as we are talking about monuments, we know that this is a conversation that is also about the legacies of racism.
Absolutely.
And we are having this conversation, and there are no other voices in the conversation in any rich and robust way, because of the ways in which those cultural artifacts can dominate the discourse and shape the discourse. And so as we discuss these, I just want to make sure to say before we wrap up that we're having this conversation about the longstanding injustices that some of the figures who have been a part of the monument, I think, can you use the word monumentized? What was the word you used before?
Monument, I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, the use of the monuments to create this sort of iconography around those individuals leaves millions of other people out of the conversation who are the direct subjects of that racial and race-based abuse. And that's really critical. The monuments shape the narrative. They help to shape a narrative that leaves so many people out of the conversation, and then also leaves their struggles out of the conversation. And that's, I think, a core principle behind which monuments get directly addressed and get directly responded to by protesters today. We live in a world where people have more and more information and knowledge about individuals, the past, and technology has played a significant role in that. And, people want to see their leaders and their sense of place recognized, and not only be part of a history that places them as the subjects.
I think it's an important distinction to make, that so many people are left out of the conversation and have been, throughout our history and throughout the history of these particular monuments. I do believe that it was interesting to listen to Jeffrey Robinson's video, and this was done in October of 2017. He says, we've reached a tipping point. We hadn't reached the tipping point. What's happened, if we just look at our recent history over the last 5 years, we know that after Charleston, there was a little bit of discussion, a little bit of movement, and then it all died down. We saw in Charlottesville, the Charlottesville uprising. Then we see a little bit more movement, a little bit more discussion, but really it died down. It was really these Black Lives Matter protests against these inequalities that really, I think, may make this the tipping point. I'm always hesitant to say that's where we are, but certainly we've seen the removal of numerous monuments, even in places that have these laws on the book that protect them. So, again, it's in flux. As a historian, it's hard for me to say, oh, we've reached the tipping point, because I won't know, until some time has passed and I can look back and say, oh yeah, that was the tipping point. But it certainly has that feeling about it, in a way that I didn't feel that after Charleston massacre or the Charlottesville uprising. It feels quite different than those two. And it was a grassroots effort that, kind of shook people in a way. And I've always been bothered by the fact that the murder of 9 Black parishioners in Charleston was not enough to move the needle.
Yeah, I just want to say that it's also a little bit incomplete to make a binary in terms of here's the South, and you had the Daughters of the Confederacy, and they had this project of creating the narrative of the lost cause, and to basically implement the erection of Confederate monuments throughout the United States. They had, in fact, I think there's one in Arizona. Last I knew, I don't think Arizona was in the Civil War, and so on. So and one even in Montana, they had designs on. And I think it's a little bit false to just ascribe it to somehow that you have this racist South, and then this kind of non-racist North. I'm being a little bit categorical, right? But I think it behooves everyone to start thinking about how the situation that we find ourselves in today is the way it is. And I think it has a lot to do with the very deep and profound ambivalence of many non-Black Americans regarding African Americans. I think that ambivalence it needs to be addressed in terms of this kind of ambivalence towards racism, even ambivalence in terms of slavery, right? Because those things didn't just happen because a group of Southern daughters decided to fund the statues and so on. They had partners in the North. They had partners everywhere among all kinds of white Americans, not necessarily descendants of Confederate soldiers, right? Some were plantation investors, for example, from the North, from Boston, from New York, and they had investments in the plantation economy. When especially during just prior to the Civil War, when the commerce of bodies started transiting, at least in discourse, to the commerce of contracts or contracted laborers. And so that ambivalence is nuanced, but vital if we are to get beyond this debate of removal or not removal, and so on.
I would go a step further for some people and say it's absolute disregard for that history. And you're correct. I mean, there was a lot of Northern investment in the domestic slave trade. And it's certainly, and I think about this now, in the 1890s as states began to disenfranchise Black men, the federal government, turns a blind eye, and then says in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 that separate but equal is okay. So segregation is okay. Yes, there are, this is not, it's not a Southern problem. It's an American problem and a global problem of racism.
Thank you both. So we have two more quick questions, and then we'll do a wrap up. People have time. We are focusing on finishing about 4:15.
The first one I want to look at is, we've had several questions asking if there are parallel international movements that we can look at for an example. A couple of folks have mentioned the denazification of Germany or taking down statues in Saddam Hussein's, after Saddam Hussein. So are there other examples we can look at for that?
I'm not as familiar with the global as I should be. So I would defer to Ken if he has that.
Well, yeah, I mean, Germany, I know that's a very pronounced one, right? But Europe has been quite a laggard in terms of dealing with these sorts of questions. I mean, if you go to Livorno, Italy, there's the so-called Four Moors statue, and it's got four African slaves shackled by the neck, and then you've got the white navigator standing above them proudly, and nobody's, I've been there, and you mention it, and they look at you like you're an alien from Mars, because like, what's the problem, and so on. So that debate, that dialogue has not taken place until very recently with any vigor. But I know that in Germany, for example, they only a couple of years ago they opened up the National Center for the Documentation of National Socialism, and it's a repository for not just an archive. They also have exhibitions and so on, and the first of several franchises, state-run, that deal explicitly in very detailed way with every aspect of the Nazi history. So that's an obvious one. But you have a lot of authoritarian states, such as in China, and there's a lot of erasure that takes place. And you might say they have an opposite problem. They need to reconstruct history there in terms of doing an pre-People's Republic of China phase, and so on. So it is a problem of history, but it's often one where it's the inverse of the problems we may be facing.
Okay, thank you. We have one final question to consider before we wrap up, focusing on how we might build public processes or conversations that might result in new kinds of monuments, and also the question of, should we keep putting up monuments and statues?
I think about in that question, I think about the National Museum of the American Indian, when they drew together what they call community curators. It could be that, that something along the lines of community curators could work together to determine, what goes in a community. I think in terms of what goes in its place, or if anything should go in its place, I mean, the first thing I think has to happen are those conversations. I do think, one of the examples that I've seen that I thought was useful was in the city of Louisville, where they came up with a program around what to do with their monuments. Excuse me. But also to decide what to do going forward. Not to make the same mistakes going forward. Sorry.
Well, I think first of all, it's not just, of course, the dialogue around what could replace something is important, and but I also think we need to even ask the question, deconstruct the question of what is a monument. Do we, and especially because right now we have a very monolithic view of what a monument is. If it doesn't look like, if it's not depictive, if it's not in bronze or some permanent type of material, especially on a pedestal, then somehow it's not a monument. But a monument has all kinds of possibilities in terms of form and material and expression. And I think it behooves us to really kind of deconstruct that question of what could be a monument, because that's not necessarily related to the question of will we still need monuments, in the sense that if you ask me the question, and I take that to mean, will we still need something to remember traumas? Will we still need something to remember or commemorate something very eventful that's important to the nation? I would say yes, but that's not necessarily, the answer to that isn't necessarily that, yes, and a monument in a certain type of highly familiar form. And even something that's very familiar in form can operate in antithetically to the way we have historically read them. There are all kinds of innovative artists that use a depictive form to allegorize a kind of different comportment for the behavior for the monument. So I think that requires a lot of work, right? But I think there's a lot of creativity out there and that should be part of the dialogue.
Thank you, Ken. Robert Smith, Dr. Smith, any final words?
Yeah, the last thing that I'd like to share is that, part of the moment we are in is also greatly informed by a set of behaviors and expressions by folks who are oftentimes, in some ways or another, draped or wearing or donning emblems of the Confederacy. And it's those same voices who will continually articulate language like Black people should go back to Africa, immigrants are not wanted here, hostile verbiage directed toward Native Americans. And so I think I'll leave with the question, if the monuments to Confederate heroes are to remain, then how do we come to understand the racial hostilities that are embraced by those who adorn the same emblems? And so as much as the monuments are about the past, they're also extraordinarily present in the ongoing racial hostilities that are central to the moment we're in, and certainly connected to the ways in which this movement for Black lives has articulated the necessity that we do something about white supremacy.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And I want to thank also Dr. Cox, Ken Lum, as well as Kristen Lethelman, Janet Seymour, of course, Jeffrey Robinson, who couldn't be here today. Thank you, Kristen and Janet, for your facilitating the Q&A questions. Dinah Penkunis, our State Historic Preservation Officer, has been online today too. And she's also going to be part of our Wisconsin Makers, Monuments, and Meaning Wisconsin conversations coming up in August. So stay tuned for that. And of course, we're using both of these conversations, these seminars, to, as what Dr. Cox and Ken suggested, working with the communities, having conversations with the communities, and thinking about how we can best use what we've learned here today to bring it to the grassroots level of communities. And that will be in Wisconsin, our local history conference and preservation conference, October 21st and October 23rd, 2020. Finally, thank you to all the participants for all your great comments on chats, your great questions. We're here for you, and we were very grateful that you were talking with each other and sharing resources as well too. All the best, everyone, and have a terrific day.